They didn't expect me to name it. Most systems came with acronyms: sterile and forgettable, DPS, X9 NetBridge, Global Sync. But mine? I called it Atlas, not because it held data, but because it held everything: the weight of global logistics, financial syncs, government nodes, and time-sensitive medical chains across 5 continents. It held me. I didn't just write the code. I shaped it, line by line, month by month. 2 years of my life, mapped into 9. 2 million nodes, 36 regional control clusters, and 1 global orchestration core. No team, no co-lead, just me in a chair that had long since lost its cushion. They thought it was about code. It wasn't. It was about breath control during live migrations, about predicting server stress spikes the same way you'd know when a violin string might snap, about understanding that a system wasn't a machine. It was a living architecture with moods, rhythms, and flaws you didn't fix. You negotiated with. I didn't build Atlas the way most engineers build systems. I grew it, like a child, like a symphony, like something that might one day outlive me. I was Rachel Lynn, lead systems architect, 36 years old, no kids, no pets, one plant that kept dying and resurrecting like some cosmic joke. My badge didn't say executive, but when things broke, they came to me. Not because I had power, but because I had answers. Atlas started as a disaster recovery prototype. It was meant to unify 3 disconnected supply chains for our European and Southeast Asian partners. But every time I found a solution, I found a better one behind it. I didn't stop when it worked. I stopped when it sang. Sometimes I'd stay past midnight, just to listen to the heartbeat of the system as it ran test simulations, the hum of the server, the way the logs whispered when data passed cleanly. Some people meditate. I debugged in silence. There were pieces of me inside that framework no one else could see. A conditional failover routine inspired by a subway delay in Seoul, a data lock shell named after my grandmother, a checksum sequence that only triggered when I whispered a specific name into the terminal mic. No one asked for that. No one knew it existed, but I did. And I think, deep down, I always knew that one day it would matter, because when you build something with your blood instead of just your hands, you don't forget where the heart is buried. I knew something was off the moment Martin stopped making eye contact. For weeks, he'd hovered around the control center like a hawk with a clipboard, checking in, nodding, occasionally throwing out buzzwords he barely understood. Dynamic indexing, real-time scalability. He loved the sound of them, even when he used them wrong. But this week, nothing, not even a nod in passing, just a brief glance at my workstation from across the floor. Then a pivot. As if I were something toxic to avoid, the team didn't notice. They were busy packing up the dry erase boards, snapping selfies under the Project Atlas Go Live Tomorrow banner, cracking champagne early in the shared lounge. I was invited. Of course, politely. A few offered tired smiles. One asked if I was okay. I said I just had a few things left to lock down. It wasn't a lie, not technically. The system was done, fully integrated, stable, beautiful, but I hadn't activated the core launch routine yet. Not the real one. See, Project Atlas didn't operate like a standard enterprise platform. It didn't start with a button or a login. It began with a handshake between the code and a specific, encrypted biometric string, a passphrase only I knew, hashed through a custom-built algorithm. It wasn't just protection, it was ownership. I stayed behind as the office emptied out. One by one, monitors went black, chairs pushed in, laughter faded into elevator chimes. Then it was just me. Me! And the hum of the server room behind the glass. The light in Martin's office was still on across the atrium, but he wasn't moving. I could see his shadow pacing, slowly. Phone pressed to his ear. He never looked up. I sat down and opened the root terminal. Init core handshake required auth sequence. I typed, slowly, carefully, each keystroke deliberate. like engraving my name into something no one else could erase. This wasn't just a launch key. It was the last thread tying me to Atlas in a way no one else understood. A digital fingerprint buried so deep. It would take months, even years, to uncover without my guidance. And if they tried to launch without it, well, the system wouldn't break. But it wouldn't wake either. Not fully. I watched the code ripple to life across the terminal. Then I encrypted the sequence. Twice. Stored the hash in a self-referencing node tied to my credentials, and closed the console. Done. I leaned back in my chair. The lounge lights were off now. Even Martin's office had gone dark. I sat in silence, staring at the Atlas interface, its glowing grid pulsing like a heartbeat, waiting for the world to meet it. And yet, somewhere in that silence, a tightness settled in my chest. Not fear, not quite, just a tremor, a flicker of knowing. I didn't want to believe it, but something in me whispered, "This isn't going to go the way you think." I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the code pulsing back at me, lines I had written by hand, encryptions no one else understood. I should have felt satisfaction, completion, but instead, I felt unsettled. Still, I came in early. Just after 7, the office was quiet, coffee machines still warming up, chairs empty, blinds tilted against the morning sun. The banner was still up in the main hallway. Project Atlas going live today. I walked past it without looking. When I reached my desk, there was already a calendar invite waiting for me. Subject line, check-in, 7:30 a.m., Martin's office. No details, no attachments, just a name. I remember staring at it longer than necessary. Something in my chest tightened, but I clicked accept. I told myself it was probably routine. Maybe he wanted a final debrief before launch. I wasn't naive, just tired of doubting everything. At 7:29, I knocked on the glass wall of Martin's corner office. He didn't look up. "Come in," he said. Already seated. There was another person in the room. I recognized her, Clara from HR. She was polite, quiet, always the one to hand out onboarding folders and awkward birthday cards. She didn't smile this time. In fact, she wouldn't meet my eyes. Martin gestured to the chair across from him, like a man assigning someone their final seat on a flight he already knew would crash. The room smelled like paper and air conditioning. I sat. My spine stiffened. Instinctively. "Rachel," he started, voice soft but distant. "First, I want to acknowledge the incredible work you've done." I blinked. "But?" I asked. Quietly. He looked surprised, maybe at how quickly I went there. "But," he continued, "as we move into the next phase of Atlas, the board and I have decided it's time for new leadership, someone who can operate the system with a more collaborative mindset." Collaborative? "I've been the only one building it," I said. "Not defensive, just flat." Martin sighed. "Exactly." I didn't respond. "This isn't about performance," he added. "It's not personal. It's just time to scale the structure beyond one person." Clara shifted beside him, opened a folder, slid a thick envelope across the desk. My name was printed in small, clean letters. Inside would be severance paperwork, an NDA, a line about how I'd voluntarily transitioned out of my role. "It's not personal," he repeated, as if that softened the cut. I felt nothing at first, just air, like the room had tilted sideways and no one else noticed. "Effective immediately?" I asked. Martin nodded. I turned to Clara. She looked down at her lap like she'd rehearsed it in front of a mirror and still couldn't get it right. I stood up slowly. My hands felt cold. My voice was calm, somehow, though my stomach had twisted into something unrecognizable. "I see," I said. Martin gave me a small nod, like that was a reasonable way to end a chapter that took 2 years of my life. No handshake, no eye contact, Just that phrase again. It's not personal. I walked out without touching the envelope. The hallway was still quiet. People were beginning to arrive. I passed two developers I used to manage. They looked up briefly, smiled. I smiled back. They had no idea. Back at my desk, I sat down one last time. I looked at my screen. Atlas was ready to launch. The interface glowed softly, waiting, like it didn't know its creator had just been erased. I logged out, and then I just sat. Not sad, not angry, not yet, just blank, like a chalkboard freshly wiped. I heard the sound of an elevator closing down the hall. Probably Martin. For a long moment, I watched the cursor blink at the login screen, like it was asking me something, and I didn't have an answer. No one told them. As I stepped out of Martin's office with my palms empty and my throat dry, the floor looked exactly the same. Coffee cups, laptops half open, someone laughing near the kitchen about a bug that got fixed in production. The office hummed with ordinary life. It was strange, almost cruel. How normal everything seemed while I was dissolving. I walked back to my desk with slow, deliberate steps, like I was underwater. Clara didn't follow me. She didn't have to. My dismissal had already taken effect, and HR protocols made it clear: no scenes, no conversations, no public acknowledgement. Clean, quiet, sanitized. That was the point. I sat down one final time at the desk I'd occupied for over 700 days. The chair still leaned slightly to the left, where the base had worn down from all those nights I stayed too long. My keyboard was warm. My monitor still displayed the Atlas command interface, waiting, pulsing, alive. For a moment, I stared at the screen and said nothing. I didn't pack up immediately. I just looked around. The desk across from mine was empty. The one beside it held a framed photo of someone's golden retriever in a party hat. My own cubicle walls were bare. No photos, no quotes, just diagrams and sticky notes now yellowed with time. It was how I preferred it. My life wasn't in the decorations. It was in the code. I pulled out a single drawer and retrieved a small pouch. It held a portable SSD, encrypted. Personal. Not company property. Inside, notes, test logs, and, more importantly, the only human-readable version of the original handshake sequence I had written by hand, the one no one knew existed, the one I had never uploaded. My hands trembled slightly as I zipped it into my coat pocket. When I stood, I moved like a shadow. No one noticed. Or maybe they did, and they just didn't know what to say. A few glanced up. One offered a nod. Another looked away too quickly. No one asked where I was going. I passed Jordan from UX. His eyes flicked toward me and then down at his keyboard. I had trained him 6 months ago. He owed his role to the system I built. He didn't speak. I stepped into the elevator alone. As the doors closed, I caught a glimpse of the Atlas launch banner still hanging in the open workspace. Today is the future. Funny. To them. I had disappeared. No press release. No farewell email. No final meeting with the team. Just a black hole where my name used to be in the Slack channels. A ghost. A ghost who knew the system better than anyone. A ghost who had wired herself into the DNA of the launch code. And as that elevator descended floor by floor, I didn't feel powerless. Erased. Yes, but not empty. They took away my title, my access badge, my chair, my inbox. But they didn't take Atlas from me. Not really. Not the way they thought. Atlas wasn't just sitting in the servers. It was still breathing. And it wouldn't open its eyes for just anyone. They didn't even ask about the handshake key. They didn't know to... Martin thought cutting me out of the launch would be seamless, that some outside hire could step in, skim the documentation, and flick a switch. He didn't understand that what I built wasn't just technical, it was relational. Atlas responded to people it trusted, and right now, that was no one. I stepped out into the parking lot. It was too bright outside. Cold air burned my cheeks. I reached into my coat, touched the pouch in my pocket, and exhaled. I didn't cry, not because I wasn't hurt, but because something in me had already moved on, moved forward. The moment I was erased from their world, I became something they couldn't see but would one day feel. The system was ready, the team was not. And Martin? He had no idea he'd just locked himself out of his own future. Some exits are loud. Mine was silent. But that silence was about to echo. There's something sacred about knowing a system can't breathe without you. Not out of arrogance, not because you want to be the only one, but because you are. Because the foundation is laced with your instincts, your structure, your pain tolerance, and your precision. Project Atlas wasn't protected by a standard password or corporate firewall. It had me, and only me. Back in the earliest days, before the architecture even had a name, I sketched out a boot integrity process unlike anything in the company's protocols. A verification shell that wouldn't just check whether it could launch, but whether it should. A chain of trust that began not with machines, but with a fingerprint, a phrase, and a human pattern that no one else would ever replicate. I never wrote the full details into the documentation, not because I wanted to sabotage anything. I built it to succeed. I built it for resilience. But deep down, I knew the day might come when control would be taken from me, not through failure, through politics. And I wasn't going to hand over my life's work to someone who saw it as just another product release. The sequence was handwritten first, then compiled, encrypted, embedded within a recursive logic loop buried in the orchestration core. Not even our senior DevSecOps leads knew it existed. I obfuscated the audit trails, randomized access logs, and layered the key in 3 separate control regions that only responded to my biometric ID. It wasn't illegal, just invisible. A safety valve, one only I could turn. And unless someone knew exactly where to look and what to look for, it would never appear. The system would seem ready. The dashboard would pulse green, but nothing would engage. Not at the core level. Not truly. Because Atlas only breathes if I tell it to. That phrase lived in my head as I sat in my apartment. Lights low, laptop open, watching from a distance. Martin thought I was out of the picture. He'd moved on. Scheduled the official launch for the following week. Word had leaked. Articles were going live. Next-gen global infrastructure deployment. Atlas prepares to revolutionize supply chain resilience. They were already rehearsing the press tour. I recognized phrases from the launch deck I'd written months ago. Except now, no one could actually launch it. I watched the chatter in the system logs. They still hadn't removed my observer access, an oversight. Maybe. Or perhaps a sign that Martin didn't think I mattered anymore. Either way, the terminal still whispered to me. Command sequences, test deployments, pings into dead air. Attempts, and every time. The core responded the same way. AU thought failure. Checksum handshake. Invalid. Of course it was. I had made sure that without the handshake, without my handshake, the system would remain asleep. Not crashed, not broken, just dormant, like a sealed chamber waiting for the right voice to speak its name. What they didn't realize was that this wasn't about encryption. It was about intention. Atlas wasn't just code, it was a living trust structure. It had layers of logic that asked not only, can you launch me, but are you the one who should? Drew, the consultant they brought in, wouldn't understand that. He'd assume it was a bug. He'd crawl through the logs, thinking he could brute force the error away. He couldn't. The failsafe I wrote would lock deeper with every incorrect attempt. Not forever, but long enough to trigger critical failover protocols that required biometric override. Mine. It wasn't revenge. It was design. I didn't want the system to collapse. I wanted it to stay intact until someone came along who respected how it was built, who didn't see it as a product to launch, but a promise to uphold. Until then, I waited, not anxiously, not angrily. I made tea. I read logs. I lit a candle beside my desk and scrolled through the heartbeat of a machine no one else could wake. It was all still there, alive, whole, silent, the kind of silence that holds power, not absence. They thought they had taken everything from me, but the truth was quiet, patient, and woven into every line of my code. You don't own a system you don't understand. And no matter what they tried next, I wasn't done. His name was Drew Stanton, Stanford graduate, published in 3 journals, interviewed twice by Wired before he turned 30, an infrastructure phenom. Someone called him on LinkedIn. Martin couldn't stop repeating that phrase during the investor call. A phenom. To the outside world, he looked like the future, sharp suits, quicker answers, and an Instagram full of server rooms and success quotes. But I knew better the first time I saw him. It was through the glass of the conference room. He was holding a laser pointer and pacing in front of a projected slide deck labeled System Reboot Strategy. His voice carried, confident, polished, as if he'd already solved a problem he hadn't begun to understand. I watched from a distance. My access badge was long deactivated, but my observer credentials, thankfully, hadn't been wiped yet. A tiny blind spot. They'd remember eventually, but not yet. Drew had the posture of someone who'd never had to rescue a broken system at 3 a.m. from a collapsing node in Singapore. He talked fast, flashed code on the screen too quickly for half the room to keep up, and treated everyone else like props in his demo. Martin sat there nodding like a bobblehead. Finally, someone who could talk fast enough to make incompetence feel like innovation. I wasn't bitter. I was fascinated, because Drew wasn't stupid. He was smart, textbook smart. He knew protocols. He could cite frameworks and rattle off deployment models with perfect syntax. But the one thing he lacked was the one thing Atlas demanded: instinct. He treated the system like a riddle to solve, not a language to speak. And that difference, that was everything. They replaced the conductor with a man who reads notes, but hears no music. By the second day, Drew had already declared the startup delay a minor misconfiguration. He assured the team a hard patch was being implemented and told the devs to relax, we've got this. He didn't ask questions, he made declarations. And that's when I knew. He hadn't found the handshake key. He hadn't even realized it existed. He thought the failure logs were random. He thought my system, my living, breathing organism, could be coerced into activation with brute force and a syntax sweep. That's like whispering math at a wolf and wondering why it doesn't heal. I read his debug notes remotely. Suspected startup conflict. Unknown delay in AOTH sequence. Line 8111 redundancy? That line was no redundancy, it was the gate. The more he probed, the more the system resisted, quietly, cleanly. No explosions, no error screens, just silence. That was the trap. Atlas didn't scream when it was being mishandled. It waited. I saw one log line that almost made me laugh. Override attempt. Insufficient entropy. It was the system's way of saying, "You don't belong here." Martin, of course, was too desperate to notice. He paraded Drew around to clients, dropped phrases like restructuring for efficiency, and called my departure a smooth succession of technical leadership. And he used my language, my diagrams, my architecture, without once admitting he didn't understand how any of it worked. That was the part that stung. If I'm honest, not being replaced, but being erased. Still, I stayed quiet, not because I couldn't intervene, but because I knew the system would speak for me. Every failed handshake, every blank response, every delayed integration and untraceable stalling routine, they were all messages, but Drew didn't know how to listen. He didn't understand that silence wasn't absence, it was resistance. And one day soon, that silence would get loud. I didn't send warnings. I didn't gloat. I just watched. From a quiet apartment with a hot mug of tea and a living. Blinking terminal still connected to the very thing they thought they controlled. And every time I saw another failed override in the logs, I smiled, not cruelly, just knowingly. Because when you build something with a soul, It doesn't answer to strangers. It was supposed to be the big moment. Monday, 9 a.m. Sharp. The official launch of Project Atlas. Internal memos had been sent. External partners were watching via secure stream. Martin even wore a suit for once, complete with a silk pocket square that felt more like wishful thinking than style. In the control room, the mood was tight, not quite celebratory, not quite tense, just full of that uneasy buzz people mistake for energy, but is really just anxiety trying not to blink first. Drew was in the center of it all. He stood at the front of the operations table like a captain ready to sail. Despite the fact that the crew still hadn't found the steering wheel, a dozen engineers sat behind monitors, all eyes on the system dashboard. A separate screen displayed the global interface. Pulsing in standby mode, Atlas was dormant, waiting. "Let's bring the future online," Drew said. He smiled. Too wide. He keyed in the startup sequence, fingers fast, confident, overconfident. From my apartment, I watched everything unfold. My observer access had finally been flagged that morning, but not before I'd already opened the log mirror. I had real-time visibility into every keystroke and system response. Not a single command escaped me. The handshake sequence came first. Standard prep, basic triggers, then the override attempt, then the silence. For 3 seconds. Nothing happened. But 3 seconds in a launch room feels like a lifetime. Shoulders tensed. A few engineers leaned forward. One tapped their keyboard, as if the system might need a nudge. Drew glanced at the screen, typed again, resent the command. Still nothing. Someone coughed in the back of the room. Another cracked their knuckles. The global interface remained unchanged. No activation, no transition to live state, just a soft, steady pulse. Init request received. AU-Tooth handshake incomplete. Drew frowned. He opened the back-end script, scrolled, paused. Then he did it. He removed line 801 from the logs. I could see the change instantly. That line. He thought it was redundant. It wasn't. It was the checksum anchor, a trigger key embedded within the fail-safe loop. It didn't just validate startup integrity. It stabilized the entire authentication shell. Without it, the structure collapsed inward. Quietly, elegantly, irrevocably. Drew hit execute, and Atlas did nothing. No error, no screen flash, no alert, just stillness. As if it had looked at him, shrugged, and gone back to sleep. In the control room, the energy shifted. You could feel it through the feed, even without audio. People sat back slowly, looked around. One engineer checked the Ethernet connection, as if the silence was a network glitch. Another waved their hand over the motion sensor. Someone whispered something to the person beside them. Drew's jaw tightened. He tried again, this time bypassing the failed sequence and manually triggering the orchestration shell. Nothing. More than silence now. It was that wet paper kind of quiet, the kind that stretches across a room and soaks through your spine. A few eyes drifted toward Martin, who stood with his arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't speak. He just watched as Drew started to sweat. The logs showed a storm of retries, force commands, hard launches, bypass attempts. Each one triggered a deeper layer of the fail-safe protocol. Each one pulled them further into the trap. Critical loop detected, auto-lock enabled, re-youth required. Someone finally said it out loud. It's not responding, not broken, not malfunctioning, just not responding. That's what made Atlas dangerous. It didn't crash. It didn't melt down. It just denied you. Silently, without explanation. And no one in that room, especially not Drew, knew how to argue with silence. By 9:27, Martin leaned over Drew's shoulder. Is it stuck? He asked, voice barely audible. Drew didn't answer. He was too busy scrolling, sweat building at his temples. The silence had settled into the walls now. Every monitor glowed like an accusation. Every blinking cursor looked like a question mark no one could answer. And me? I watched from miles away, wrapped in a wool blanket, sipping coffee that had gone cold. I didn't cheer, I didn't smirk. I just sat still, like Atlas, quiet, composed, because this wasn't the disaster, not yet. This was only the beginning. The logs began to blink red at 9:31 a.m. Not yellow, not orange, not a friendly, hey, something might be off. Red, bold, blinking. A color you don't want to see when you're handling global infrastructure with real-time client dependencies on the live screen in the operations room. The interface froze mid-transition. No crash report. No recovery prompt. Just a flicker. And then silence. That familiar, damning silence. Then the lights across the server dashboard dimmed, one by one, as Atlas began shutting itself down. It didn't stall. It withdrew. Back at my apartment, I watched the event log spike. It was happening. The checksum anchor had been erased. The security protocols were cascading, just as designed. Core authorization failure. Entropy level below minimum threshold. Trust shell rejected. Triggering system purge. Within 60 seconds. 9. 2 petabytes of synchronized global data began disassembling. Not instantly, not with a bang, but in waves. Deletion threads rolled out like ripples on black water. What made it worse was how quiet it was. In the control room. Drew hovered over the console. His hands froze mid-keystroke. One of the engineers stood up and whispered, "That's not a simulated purge, is it?" No one answered. Then the alert started. Client portals disconnected. Internal dashboards returned empty queries. The redundancy clusters blinked out of sync. On-screen projections flashed red across Asia. Then Europe. Then South America, data centers severed from the core like nerves cut from a brain. One of the junior analysts muttered, "We just lost all of Brazil," another said. "France is dark." By 9:34, 6 continents were offline, and the phones began to ring. At first, it was just a few. Account reps fielding confused calls from partner clients, asking why they couldn't access their platforms. But then came the executives, the investors, the foreign operations heads. The conference line lit up. Emergency Zoom sessions launched automatically on one of the monitors. The screen filled with the face of a VP from a medical logistics firm in Munich. She was pale, furious, trembling. "Where's the data? We had active transplant routes running." Seconds later, a different window appeared. CEO of a retail infrastructure chain in Chicago. "You assured us of system stability." Then the loudest came from Singapore. A financial director screaming into her webcam, "You destroyed us!" Martin stood frozen. His hand clutched the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. Drew was typing furiously, but nothing worked. The system had already gone past rollback. The auto-purge was final, recursive, and irreversible once engaged. "Why can't you stop it?" Martin finally yelled. Drew's voice cracked. I don't know where it's anchored. The triggers. There's no rollback point logged. It's like it's eating itself." "It's a full collapse," one engineer whispered. "No backups. They're being overwritten as we speak." "What about the cold storage sites?" Martin snapped. "They're bound to core integrity." Someone replied, "Atlas won't accept them unless the main shell validates." Martin spun toward Drew. "Undo it." "I can't," Drew said. "You're the one who made the change." Drew turned pale. "I didn't know that line was critical." That line 811, the checksum gate that tied the system's integrity to its author. They didn't know. They never knew. And now, it was too late. I sat at home, eyes fixed on the log stream. I wasn't proud, but I wasn't guilty either. I had warned no one, but I had harmed no one, until they assumed control of what they didn't understand. I had built Atlas to defend itself, and when the wrong hands tried to open it, it had done exactly that. At 9:41 a.m., all live sessions went dark. Atlas had completed its purge. There were no more clients online, no more data packets flowing, no heartbeat, just an empty shell sitting on top of billions of dollars in ruined infrastructure and zero recovery paths. The feed showed Martin staring into space, lips parted, eyes vacant. Drew was seated now, elbows on knees, hands in his hair. No more typing. The room was quiet again, but this wasn't the quiet of confidence anymore. This was the quiet of impact, the kind that comes after the fall, when no one knows what to say, because they know it's over, and I, still watching from my apartment, finally leaned back. I had said nothing, touched nothing, but the code remembered who it trusted. And everyone else forgot who built the heartbeat they just killed. The first call came at 10:03 a.m. I didn't answer. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, lukewarm but comforting, watching the early sunlight cut across the countertop. The city outside moved like any other Monday, unaware that inside a certain corporate tower, chaos had chewed through the heart of an empire. The second call came at 10:05. Martin. I let it go to voicemail. A third call, then a fourth. My phone buzzed so much I flipped it over and let the screen face the table. I didn't need to see the names. I already knew. I sipped my coffee and opened my laptop instead, not to respond, but to observe. The logs had gone quiet. Atlas was in full lockout mode now. The system's shell had closed itself like a fist, and no amount of swiping, pleading, or apologizing would get it to open again, not unless it heard the voice it trusted. Mine. At 10:12, the messages started coming in. The first email was from Clara, HR. A soft, awkward reach-out. Hi, Rachel. I know this is unexpected, but Martin would like to reconnect at your earliest availability. Then Martin himself. Rachel, please, I need your help. We've hit something we can't solve. If there's anything you can do. Followed by, I'll make it worth your time. You'll be credited properly. You can name your terms. And then, less polished, tell me what I have to do. I leaned back in my chair. The birds outside my window chirped faintly, like the world was perfectly fine, because, for me, it was inside their building. The walls were probably still vibrating with disbelief. Martin would be pacing, Drew likely white-knuckling his chair. Teams would be pointing fingers, engineers rechecking the same lines of code over and over again, hoping the outcome would somehow change, but they wouldn't find the answer, because the answer wasn't in the code. It never was. It was in me. A system doesn't forget the hands that built it. It resists what it doesn't recognize. And Atlas? Atlas wasn't broken. It was loyal. At 10:24, Martin tried again, this time by voice. I let it go to voicemail again, then listened with one ear. His voice cracked halfway through. Rachel, I don't know what you did, but I know you're the only one who can fix this. Please, call me back. We'll undo what happened. I'll make it right. It was the first time his voice trembled. That was new. He'd fired me with perfect posture and a script rehearsed to the syllable. Now. That voice was unraveling. Not angry, not commanding, desperate. I didn't reply. Not because I was being cruel, but because some lessons are only learned in silence, and some systems, like trust, only reset when the old operating model completely fails. I got up and refreshed my coffee. The aroma filled the kitchen again. I glanced once more at my phone. More missed calls, more unread messages. A small mountain of regret building on a screen they never thought I'd be holding. I didn't need to say a word. They already knew. The messages didn't stop. By noon, there were 16 missed calls, 8 emails, 3 LinkedIn requests, 1 DM from someone I hadn't spoken to in 4 years that simply read, Hey, I heard about Atlas. They're saying you're the only one who can fix it. Is that true? Yes, but that wasn't the point. It was never about fixing the system. It was about why it broke in the first place. Martin had underestimated more than just me. He had misunderstood the nature of Atlas entirely. He thought it was a product, a tool, something built to obey, no matter who gave the orders. But Atlas had always been more than that. It had intuition wired into its foundation. Every decision matrix, every behavioral failsafe, every nested shell, it all pulsed with one underlying principle: trust matters, and now, the system had proven it. Martin's most recent message had arrived only minutes before. Rachel, we're past the point of pride. We're talking lawsuits, press inquiries. If you step in now, I'll make sure the board recognizes your authorship. You'll be the face of Atlas moving forward. Name your price. I read it twice, and then, for the first time in 3 days, I picked up my phone. No calls, no explanations, no apologies. Just one sentence. I opened a blank reply window, typed slowly, deliberately, each word a key turning in the final lock. You don't launch a soul-built system with someone who only understands syntax. That was it. No greeting, no sign-off, no room for misinterpretation. I hit send. Then I flipped the phone over and placed it screen down on the table. The room was quiet, except for the soft sound of water boiling on the stove. I stood, walked over, and dropped a single jasmine tea sachet into my favorite mug. It bloomed like a flower, slow, graceful, inevitable. I didn't need to hear Martin's response. In fact, I hoped I wouldn't. There was nothing more to say. The sentence I sent wasn't cruel. It wasn't even angry. It was truth, condensed, distilled, and served without venom. A sentence shaped like a mirror, forcing him to see the flaw in everything he'd built since the day he erased me. Atlas didn't reject him because of bad code. It rejected him because it knew who it was written for, and who it wasn't. I sat down, cupped my hands around the warm mug, and exhaled. For the first time in weeks, I felt the absence of tension in my spine. No deadlines, no performative meetings, no false praise, just peace. They would scramble. They'd try to rewrite the code, rebuild the structure, reverse engineer what they didn't understand. But it wouldn't work. Not because I sabotaged it, because I'd built it to be loyal. And loyalty, once betrayed, doesn't reboot on command. Maybe someday, someone else would earn the system's trust, someone who listened, someone who understood that not everything in tech is transactional. But it wouldn't be Martin. And it definitely wouldn't be Drew. I sipped my tea, still warm, and looked out the window. The sky was clear. The day was moving on. So was I, sometimes. The loudest revenge is silence wrapped in one perfect line. The media labeled it the $300 million line of code. That single phrase showed up everywhere, from tech blogs to front-page business news. Anchors said it with awe. Skeptics spat it with disdain. But no one questioned the number. It was accurate. One misplaced line, one misunderstood deletion, 9.2 petabytes of vanished client infrastructure, and a ripple effect that would take months, maybe years, to calculate in full. Within 48 hours of the failed launch, 5 of Atlas's top clients announced full termination of partnership. Their public statements were polite, exploring other infrastructure solutions, seeking independent recovery options, but the tone was unmistakable. They were gone, and they weren't coming back. By day 3, the stock dropped 17%. By day 5, it dropped another 28%. Investors panicked. Analysts called it an implosion masked as innovation. Some suggested fraud. Others blamed leadership turnover. But internally, there was only one consensus. Atlas had failed because they fired the wrong person. I didn't say that. Of course. I didn't have to. The journalists said it for me. They dug up archived engineering updates I had posted during the early phases of the build. One article quoted a year-old Slack thread where I warned it about the consequences of skipping biometric integrity checks. Another publication pulled screenshots of a whiteboard I used in a tech talk, highlighting the exact portion of the launch sequence Drew had deleted. The coverage wasn't kind to Martin. CEO's rush to market destroys billion-dollar trust network. Graves gambles, loses leadership, and the confidence of a continent. The system didn't crash, it resisted. I kept the notifications muted, but sometimes I scrolled anyway. Mostly to remind myself that silence does. In fact, have a sound, especially when it echoes through systems built on hubris. By the end of the second week, the board had forced Martin into an emergency retirement. The statement was clinical, citing organizational restructuring. But the truth was obvious. He was out. The man who once stared at me with a practiced smile and said, "It's not personal," had just been personally erased. Reports later revealed that Drew had submitted his resignation the same day, quietly, without ceremony. He was already scrubbing his LinkedIn by the time the news broke. Internally, chaos bloomed, departments fought over blame, legal scrambled to contain breach allegations. IAID attempted recovery protocols from backup chains that didn't exist. And worst of all, Atlas itself was now radioactive. No one wanted to touch the system, much less trust it. They tried to pivot. They launched a public bug bounty program, offered free service credits to placate remaining clients, but the reputation damage was done. Atlas had been marketed as untouchable, unstoppable, and now it had become a monument to what happens when vision is stripped of the very person who built it. I didn't attend the fallout meetings, obviously, but I saw the agendas. Someone forwarded me the notes anonymously. It was all there, lists of what went wrong, proposals for what to salvage. Committees formed to redefine trust structures. Irony, served ice cold. The most surreal moment came in the form of a request from a third-party audit firm working with the board. They asked if I'd be willing to consult as part of a post-mortem analysis, paid generously. Of course, my insights, they said, would be invaluable. I didn't reply, not out of spite, but because some structures don't deserve rebuilding. Let them learn, let them fumble, let them archive the lesson into a PDF no one will ever read, only to repeat it again in a different building, under a different name. What mattered wasn't that they fell. What mattered was that the system that erased me was now erasing itself, piece by piece, policy by policy, ego by ego. It was never just a code failure, it was a values failure. And now, as the firm bled clients, lost capital, and drifted toward irrelevance, the justice I once dreamed of chasing had arrived on its own. No courtrooms, no speeches, no revenge, just gravity, doing what gravity does. I closed the last article, shut my laptop, poured myself a glass of water. It tasted clean, uncomplicated. They had called it the $300 million line of code. But it was never about the line. It was about the person who knew never to delete it. It was exactly 11 months to the day. Same city, same skyline, same conference center with too much glass and too little warmth. But this time, I didn't enter through the back service door with a guest badge clipped to my jacket. This time, I walked in as a keynote speaker. The future of secure architecture. Room 3B. Full attendance. No empty chairs. The badge around my neck read, Rachel Lynn, founder and lead architect, NovaCore Systems. NovaCore hadn't started as a company. It started as a quiet experiment, a response to everything that had gone wrong. I didn't set out to compete with Atlas. I set out to build what it should have been. No bloat, no ego, no boardroom interference, just clean logic, built on human-first design. Security by intent, not by fear. Trust that didn't just come from code, but from the people behind it. In less than 6 months, 3 of Atlas's former clients had reached out to me directly. No lawyers, no PR reps. Just quiet messages that said, "We believe in what you built. Can we talk?" I didn't sell to all of them, but I listened, and the ones who understood what had really happened, the ones who saw through the noise, Those are the ones I partnered with. NovaCore didn't need a marketing department. It had proof. It worked. It scaled. It healed what Atlas broke, and it answered to no one but its users. I stepped up to the stage just as the moderator finished their intro. The spotlight was gentle. The room hushed. I looked out at rows of faces, some curious, some skeptical, some hopeful. I smiled, not because I needed their approval, but because I had nothing left to prove. "I'm not here to talk about the past," I said into the mic, voice steady. "I'm here to talk about what happens when we design systems that remember where they came from." I didn't name Martin. I didn't reference Drew. I didn't need to. Everyone in that room already knew the story. They'd read the headlines, watched the collapse, seen the slow unraveling of a system that forgot who created it. But more importantly, they saw what came next. Me, not as a symbol of vengeance, but of vision. When the talk ended, I stepped down to light applause, not thunderous, but real. Several hands reached out. A few familiar faces approached, not as gatekeepers anymore, but as equals. Outside the main hall, a small booth displayed the NovaCore interface. Simple, elegant, alive. One of the demo units showed a live map of a medical logistics chain that now depended entirely on our infrastructure. It pulsed with quiet strength. And as I stood there, watching people engage with something I'd built on my terms, I felt no need to gloat. I didn't need them to fail for me to rise. They'd collapsed because their foundation was never real. I had rebuilt mine, on clarity, integrity, and control. Not control of others, control of self. A young developer walked up and asked, "How did you know it would all come back to you?" I smiled gently and said, "It didn't come back. I moved forward." Because the truth is, I was never fired. I was freed. And some systems, they only answer to the ones who gave them life.